Dear learners, welcome back to the second part of the program, Women and Migration. In this program, we will be discussing international perspectives of women and migration. Today in the studios, I have with me an expert in this area, Dr. Usha George, who is a professor and Dean of the Faculty of Community Services, Ryerson University, Toronto, Canada. Her teaching and scholarship is in the area of immigration and settlement. She has an excellent track record of research and publication in the same area. Professor Usha George, we have already discussed in the first episode that what is migration. So the learners are aware of the national trends of migration and how migration takes place within the territory of Indian Union. I would now like you to talk about the international perspective of feminization of migration.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the tendencies in modern times that has identified is the feminization of international migration. More and more women are moving from their country of origin to different parts of the world in search of work. In fact, female immigrants constituted about 49% of the world's migrants in 2010, with an overrepresentation of females in the age group 65 and over. Of the total world migrants of 214 million, 104 million were women. Especially in Asia, this is very pronounced, as about half of the immigrants in Asia are women. And an increasing number of female immigrants are going to different countries in search of employment. And about 70 to 75% of refugees are women and children. And people who are trafficked are also women and children. They form the highest number of trafficking.
Professor George, how is immigration gendered? What I mean to say is, what is the role gender play in the process of immigration?
Gender differences determine migration in many different ways. One is a woman's position in the society, in the community, the family, and as an individual influences the decision to immigrate. In other words, the higher the position the woman has in the family and the community and higher employment status, she has a voice in the decisions about immigration. If her status is low, then she doesn't have much of a voice. Most of the time, family reunification is the reason why many women immigrate, but more recently, many women are immigrating to find jobs for themselves in order to be the breadwinners of the family. Then, migration for domestic work is increasingly becoming common, and that means that domestic work is even treated as an extension of the reproductive function of women, and therefore there are major policy and program gaps in this area. And as we all know, women also occupy very low skilled jobs. The majority of low skilled workers are women migrants. And there are gender differences even in the money that is being repatriated to their home countries. It has been shown that men usually repatriate money or send money home for investment purposes. Women, on the other hand, send money basically to look after the kids they have left home, or even to look after their own family members like parents and siblings and so on. So the transnational parenting, transnational mothering is becoming quite common, and there is a chain of caring that is happening internationally.
What are the gendered integration outcome of immigration or migration for women?
As we all know, the UN Convention on the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families was adopted in 1990, but it came into force in 2003. It took about 13 years to get at least 20 countries to sign on to this convention. Right now, there are 46 countries who have signed on to this convention. The gender neutral language of the convention has created lots of issues for women in their attempts to integrate into the countries that they have been to. For example, especially in the area of sexual reproductive health, women are exploited simply because they do not have the rights, and the policy is neutral in terms of its designation of gender and what it means. On a more specific level, we can see that the labor market outcomes for women, international migrants, are much lower than that of men. The labor force participation of immigrant women are much lower. They are predominantly found in traditional female jobs like home care or housework, or the lower end of the service jobs. Recent immigrants have lower earnings than immigrants who have been there for a long time, and especially in the case of migrant women, it has been demonstrated that for every dollar or so that an immigrant man makes, the woman makes maybe 40 to 50 cents, or even much less than 60 cents. So there is a major discrepancy even in terms of the incomes they get for the same type of work in their host countries. So the labor market outcomes are much less desirable for women. And many immigrant women at times live in poverty, in situations of poverty, if they are not able to find appropriate jobs for their for themselves, and they are also putting pressure on themselves to send money home for their children so that they can actually use this money, and this in turn affects the health status of women and their own mental health status, because they are always stressed out and tense about the employment status, the income, and the amount of money they have to repatriate, in addition to the worries they have about their children at home, their parents and siblings and so on. So it is a precarious existence, I would say, in the long run.
That brings to my mind that since you are coming from Canada, and Canada is a multicultural country,
right.
What is the situation of migrant women in a multicultural society like Canada?
Many of what I said right now applies to immigrant women in Canada as well, but it is much better than many other countries. For example, many of the young women from the Philippines, Cambodia, Vietnam, so on, go to do housework, domestic work in many different parts of the world. Canada also has its own share of those workers called live-in caregivers. They are protected by policy, but even then there are some of us who believe that the policies could be stronger to protect from vulnerabilities that are open out there. Generally, immigrant women are seen as oppressed by the intersections of race, gender, class and immigrant status. And as I said before, sometimes those who are coming on a family kind of reunification visa is treated differently from those who come on an economic visa status. But then, the labor market is extremely competitive. Mm-hmm. Women are at a disadvantage simply because women have to do what is called the work-life balance, the caring and the provisioning labor at home, and therefore many of them will have to take breaks from the labor market because childcare is extremely expensive. So all of that can add to the complexities of women's existence, and that applies even to Canada.
My next question is again related to women in Canada and specifically to the immigrants. Mm-hmm. So, see, on one hand, there is a policy to bring in more people mm-hmm. to, be absorbed in employment. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, the employment status is going down in Canada. Mm-hmm. So, how are the two forces which are opposite to each other
right.
Operationalizing in Canadian society?
It has been an age-old problem. Mm-hmm. If you take a look at some of the documents on immigrant women written in the 60s, you find the same contradiction written there. Canada needs immigrants to maintain its population mm-hmm. growth and to sustain the economy and to create economic growth. At the same time, those who are brought into the country are not able to find appropriate employment in the labor market simply because of credentialing issues and lack of Canadian experience, and the reluctance of employers to try out new immigrants simply because they think that the new immigrants are probably not up to the par of like Canadian workers. So all of those are issues that plague the immigrants and their entry into the labor market, and yet it's going on for a long time. But these days there are some policy initiatives to help immigrants, especially before they immigrate, they are told about the different employment situation and what they need to do to get their degrees assessed and so on and so forth. So minor changes in the immigration policy are constantly being made in order to ensure that people who come there, especially economic immigrants who are recruited on the basis of their strengths, their education, their experience and so on, do not find themselves being frustrated by the difficulties in the labor market.
You just talked about feminization of immigration, and Canada has a huge population of immigrants. How do you see feminization in context of Canada?
Much the same way, but I should immediately add that many women who are coming these days are coming in the economic class, I'd say, or even if they are coming for family reunification, they are highly qualified. So the old story about immigrant women are all uneducated, they are so vulnerable, they are so poor and they cannot speak English, is kind of changing gradually because the women who are coming have got all of these qualifications. So at the same time, there's much literature that talks about, as I said, the multiplicities and the intersections of oppressions they experience and the difficulty to break the barriers that are out there for them. So it is a constant struggle. Even in Canada, we cannot say that we have got it right. Many people struggle, especially the struggle of women is much more, I would say, simply because of all the factors I mentioned, the need to take care of the kids, the caring and the provisioning work, and the barriers they face across in the society.
What is the effect on motherhood and care work vis-a-vis immigrant women in Canada?
Right. There has been an argument that the domestic work is now downloaded to third world women, because most of the women who come under the live-in caregiver program in Canada are women from third world countries, or I should say developing countries. So these women are the ones who effectively look after the kids, while women who are in the mainstream society go out to work or do whatever. Okay. So that's definitely happening. And then on their own, these women who have come for domestic work have left their families back home. So that means that they have to send money to these families, they have to look after or even inquire about or find out or even be worried about the well-being of their children. So this is now called transnational mothering and the caring work, and usually this is done by done by these women, and so we can talk about an international care network where the mothers of these women are looking after, in other words, the grandparents are looking after the grandchildren while the mothers are out in different countries doing work in order to earn a living.
Then there is another phenomenon which has been observed vis-a-vis immigrant women, that is underutilization of services. Would you please enlighten us about this phenomenon of underutilization of services?
Right. In Canada and many other countries of the world where immigrant women come or immigrants come, there are many services that are available to them. Usually we find that immigrant women do not find out about these services. First of all, they are busy taking care of their children or their household, they are looking for work, and many of them are not aware of the existing services, including health services. And it has been shown, for example, that immigrant women, a large number of them do not even have a family doctor. In Canada, almost everybody has a family doctor. And it also has been shown that any kind of preventive services, especially preventive mental health services and so on, are totally outside the immigrant women's experience. And the underutilization happens mainly, I would say, because of a lack of understanding of what happens, but it is also, there are what are called cultural constructions of caring work and of health and well-being. Many immigrant women will consider that a small pain or a discomfort is not important, my family's health is more important, and so they are all trained actually to look after their family, or culturally they are taught or they learn to look after their families and to put priority for the family rather than their own well-being. So they kind of dismiss whatever ailments they have as insignificant and they pay attention more to their family. So that's how they underutilize services. And then the informal sector does not help much, but probably a lot of them get the information through friends and relatives and so on.
What may be the possible reasons for your underutilization of services by immigrant women?
I want to continue on the theme of that cultural notions around health and well-being. As I said, many of the women, when they feel discomfort or uncomfortable feelings, will think it's natural, it's okay, you know, this is how we are brought up and you have to endure everything and so on and so forth. My own research has shown that many South Asian immigrant women, even when they feel sad and sorrowful and feel like crying, they do all of that, but do not recognize that there could be a health issue behind. For example, those are typical symptoms of what you call depression. In the Western countries, you know, people are immediately available to sort of diagnose that, but in the case of immigrant women, they treat it as 3 separate issues and then they dismiss that off. That is just the cultural norms around you know, what is it to be healthy. And then they also feel that, well, it is not appropriate for me to talk about these things because there is a stigma attached to mental health, and therefore even if I am crying all the time, even if I am feeling sad, even if I feel deprived, I should not be talking about it because that's not appropriate. The second is again what we call a collectivistic cultural context that is at odds with what you find the individualistic and sort of interrogative approach to health in Canada. In other words, in Canada people are taught to have, you know, to have their own understanding of health, to be educated about their health, to be aware of themselves and to be able to articulate what problems they have in their health. But for many of the immigrant women who come from collective families and collectivistic cultures, as I said before, they do not actually individually interrogate their own health status on a regular basis. And then one more factor I would add to this underutilization is language issues. Even when immigrant women are capable of articulating their ideas in English, many of them do not feel that they can actually ask people, where do I find this service or the other. But in many other cases, immigrant women are not necessarily comfortable with English language. They are not necessarily comfortable with going to a family physician and talking about issues they have, and therefore those language barriers, you know, not necessarily just the ability to speak the language, but also the ability to literally articulate what exactly is it that they want to know, is a difficult problem. And again, another research study that I had clearly showed that even family doctors, when they treat immigrant women or when they look at immigrant women, they are reluctant to prescribe certain tests, for example. Like in Canada, everybody does, above the age of 55 or so now, does a mammogram every 2 years. Family physicians are reluctant to tell you know, immigrant women, especially in my study it was South Asian immigrant Tamil women, they were reluctant to tell them because they said they wouldn't go anyway, so why would we tell them to go? So there is the system also working against immigrant women because they are not being told as to what they should be doing. So it works both ways and disadvantages immigrant women in both ways.
So that brings in the question of race and ethnicity. That does migration has differential effect on race and ethnicity of the people who are migrating?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, feminist scholars have done a great deal of work in looking at the intersections of race, gender, class, immigrant status, age, and all those social identity factors and how they interact with each other, how they interlock with each other to create oppressive situations and negative outcomes for immigrant women. Definitely. If you look at women who haven't got jobs and who, in spite of very high qualifications, are finding it impossible to get into the labor market, a lot of them are women from minority communities, especially what we call visible minorities. Yes.
Another thing comes to my mind is that do you see any difference in immigration pattern and the outcomes with respect to Canada and other developed countries and developing countries?
Right. To be fair, I would argue that Canadian outcomes for Canadian immigrants are much better than many other countries. Australia and New Zealand may be slightly better than us, because they have got clear policies around, or they are kind of monitoring some of the situations. But I wouldn't say that they are way better than Canada. But I would put Australia, Canada and New Zealand in the first category of countries where they have better outcomes for immigrants, and especially immigrant women, because the gendered nature of immigration, the gendered nature of service delivery, the gendered nature of the labor market, the gendered nature of society's attitude towards women and work, these are all taken into consideration in many aspects in Canada. At the same time, we also recognize that the labor market is totally outside anybody's control. So the vagaries of the labor market cannot be understood or even forecast, and then what does that have an impact on women is difficult to foresee, but it does happen. In many different parts of the world, for example, in the US, since it's a huge economy, women may be finding jobs, but are they appropriate to their skills? And maybe sometimes it could be simply because the nature of the regulatory bodies and the way in which they allow people to enter that profession is maybe different in the US, and therefore there may be a differential outcome. But in many of the developing countries, the internal migration that is happening is, I haven't done much research in that area, but my sense is that they are all for low skilled work, very low paid, insecure kind of work, which has very little pensions or any other health benefits. So they definitely have differential outcomes for women.
Would you also throw light on the phenomenon of trafficking, which is also associated with the migration?
Right.
How do trafficking go with migration?
Okay, trafficking goes all over the world. Trafficking happens all the time, both men and women. But in the case of women, the trafficking happens for explicitly sexual exploitation, and therefore that has got much more impact on women as a community, women and children. Many countries have got regulations and rules preventing those, but I don't think anybody can rightly say that we have controlled trafficking of women. Canada, for example, is a signatory to with a number of countries against female trafficking and trafficking of children. But definitely there are people who come in, especially in certain professions like dancing and all of those kinds of professions where people are brought in, and then some of them are also brought in to do very menial jobs, and they're exploited by the employers simply because they have absolutely no right. And having the ability to stay in the country is seen as a big advantage for these women who could otherwise be expelled to their own home countries or wherever. So that, when you consider that, a lot of women accept these conditions as sort of something they will endure, but I don't think they have any escape from very oppressive employment conditions. Definitely people have to take a little more of a proactive step in order to ensure that trafficking is much less, and that's the case everywhere.
Is there any redressal mechanism which can provide some succor to the women who are trafficked and want to go back to their home country?
I'm not aware of any reasonably sound mechanisms where women can call a hotline or anything like that. They are all sort of based on one case-by-case basis, I am tempted to believe, simply because the fact that the women are in a country illegally and trafficked, puts an immense burden on the women in sort of exposing their traffickers, so to speak.
Okay.
And many of them would rather be in Canada than go back to their countries. Some time ago, I remember talking to a woman who actually had a number of other women with her. They all paid $4,000, $5,000, this is about 20 years ago, to a trafficker who actually hid them in a truck and drove through the bridges, and they were not detected. They came out and when they entered Canada, they stopped at a coffee shop and everybody got out of the truck and they celebrated simply because they were able to cross the borders. Now they have crossed the borders, they are in the country. The Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms prevents people from being deported without appropriate processing, appropriate hearing, and so on and so forth. So they can be there forever. They would rather have that situation than being somewhere else. So it is very difficult actually to encourage these women to report the fact that they were trafficked, because they were actually in some cases participated in that simply because they wanted to be in the country. But there are hundreds and hundreds of people who absolutely do not want to be trafficked and do not want to be taken away from the country, and they are taken away without their will or outside their will. I don't think there are any reasonably good mechanisms for them to have some redress to that situation.
Thank you, Professor Usha George, for being with us today and enlightening our students vis-a-vis feminization of immigration, and I hope our learners will benefit immensely from this conversation. Thank you once again, Professor George, and thank you for being with us today.